So, a tale of three journeys. So when, a little under 2 years ago, our friend and colleague Helen Percival asked me whether I would consider succeeding her as the next general practitioner to be president of Nottingham Medico, I was, of course, honoured and delighted. That was until it suddenly dawned on me that I'd have to stand here this evening and deliver a presidential address. That's suddenly when, somewhere from the depths of my memory, I remembered a physiology lecture from over 30 years ago at Leicester, something to do with the fight-flight response. Or in my opinion, this very much suddenly turned into the flight-only response. As it is, I've managed to overcome my fear of public speaking and hopefully will deliver a presidential address for you this evening. So let me introduce you to a family friend. Those of you who are close enough can see at the front of the lecture theatre a little wooden mouse, and you might be asking, where does this fit into the presidential address? Well, let me introduce you to a family friend. Many years ago, when I met my wonderful wife Jane, who is with me this evening to support me, despite having qualified as a doctor, I remained incredibly shy and lacking in self-confidence. One evening we were watching the TV news when a clip came on from the House of Commons, and an MP stood up and uttered those familiar words, "Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker." At this, Jane, likening me to a nervous dormouse, exclaimed, "You're not Mr. Speaker, Dean, but you're Mr. Squeaker." This name has stuck with me amongst close family and friends for almost 30 years. And yes, Jane, I've even brought the wooden mouse tonight that you bought me 30 years ago. So, having overcome my fear of public speaking, here I am to deliver my presidential address. So why a tale of three journeys? First of all, I'd like to just briefly touch on my journey into medicine and why it means so much to be able to stand before you this evening as your president for the year. Also, I'd like to take you on a short journey around Nottingham, the places and people which make the place where we live and work the great city that it is. And finally, I'd like to introduce you to my third journey, which is my chosen charity for the year, the Links and Knots Air Ambulance. And hopefully somebody from that charity will be here to discuss some of the incredible journeys they undertake every year. So my journey into the medical profession, which route describes my journey? For many of you, I suspect, without wanting to appear jealous, although still hard work, the journey was probably very much like travelling along the road on your left. Well, for me, it was pretty much like the journey on the right, trying to navigate Spaghetti Junction. So my early life, you're probably thinking, well, what's this rather abstract picture got to do with my early life? I was born in Arnold, just a short distance from where we are this evening, and I'm not from a medical family. Indeed, my parents owned a small grocery shop. And not long after I was born, unfortunately, a fine fair supermarket opened just a few doors away. And for anyone in the audience who claims to be too young to remember, Fine Fair was one of the first big supermarket chains which helped to revolutionise the high street, changing shopping habits for all time and bringing about the demise of corner shops. Near bankruptcy ensued, my dad returned to his former profession as a quantity surveyor, but even so I enjoyed a very happy childhood with my two brothers. My parents were always very supportive and encouraging. My secondary education was spent at Arnold Hill Comprehensive School, and I joined in the second year of comprehensive education. Very early on I decided I wanted to be a doctor, which in hindsight was probably as a result of watching TV programmes such as Horizon and Tomorrow's World. It was unusual for students from my school at that time to go to university, let alone wish to study medicine. But I was determined and so followed the route. I recall vividly catching a train to Southampton to attend a medical school interview. And in those days, universities, I'm sure many of you will know, did not have open days for prospective candidates, and parents were conspicuous by their absence. Very different to my recent experience when I went with my daughters Rebecca and Katie on numerous open days around a tour of the universities of Great Britain. I applied to Southampton, Newcastle, and unfortunately 36 years after the event, I can't quite recall where else I applied to. So, unfortunately, Southampton made me one offer of BBB, which I fell short of obtaining, getting A in biology, C in economics, and a rather unsatisfactory D in chemistry. So, undeterred and against the advice of my head of sixth form, I decided to resit my A-levels and reapply. I guess I was fortunate at the time in being able to do so, as in the current competitive climate for medical education, I'd just have been resigned to the scrap heap and told off to go off and do something different. So I went off to Digby College of Further Education, which is now a housing estate, and was fortunate to have some great teachers. I resat my chemistry, although with a different exam board and a very different syllabus, and decided to do A-level psychology from scratch in a year. I can recall spending the best part of a morning observing people using a pelican crossing and trying to predict which group, gender, etc., were more likely to wait for permission to cross with the green man rather than try and dart across without permission. So the second attempt was more successful, well, at least to begin with. My second round of university applications, I got 2 Bs from Sheffield and Leicester, and even to this day can recall my interview at University College London. During that fateful interview, the dean, who was chairing a rather awesome-looking panel of 3 on a raised platform, with me sat somewhere down there in front of them, asked the unfortunate question, if I was to make you an unconditional offer now on the grades which you already have secured, what would you say? Struggling to think on my feet, as I knew that deep down I wanted to stay as near to home as possible, I replied that I'd have to decline their kind offer, as I hoped to achieve 2 Bs required by Leicester. I was sent out of the interview room thinking, well, that's that then, I've blown that chance, and was called back in a few minutes later by the dean, who addressed me by saying that I'd shown great openness and honesty, and that if I failed to get into Leicester, UCL would still take me, just give him a ring. So their honesty and integrity hopefully would have shone through if Leicester hadn't have accepted me. So I managed to achieve a B in chemistry and a B in psychology, and off to Leicester I went. But it wasn't plain sailing. I recall vividly to this day the volume and complexity of the first 2 years, failing every single exam with the exception of Man in Society, which was sort of a cross of public health, statistics, and a few other bits and pieces which weren't really very scientific. Even now I can see vividly the exam marks, which in those days were not emailed to you in the privacy of your own home or student flat. Oh no, you had to go down to the medical school sciences building, where at an appointed time the administrator would appear and pin the exam results on the notice board. Even worse, they were posted in rank order with a line drawn in red below which you had failed. And needless to say, my name, Dean Temple, often appeared below the red line. I resat second MB, as it was then called, during a long summer vacation and somehow managed to pass. Maths improved dramatically once I got into the clinical years, and I passed all my exams and really started to enjoy the course once we got into the clinical bit. I had another wobble during my final year, thinking that a career in medicine was not for me after all, and I applied to Nottingham University to study for a PGCE, wanting to go off and be a biology teacher. The chair of the interview panel at that stage said, well, at least go off and do as they were then called your house jobs, and if you still want to be a teacher at the end of that, come back to me. One of the best pieces of advice I've ever received. My fear of autumn. As we approached finals, real fear set in, and I'm sure it did for everybody else in the room as well, particularly regarding the surgical long case clinical examination. At Leicester, we were fortunate to have an excellent but terrifying professor of surgery, whose famous saying was, "Mr. Smith, look out of the window and tell me what colour the leaves are on those trees." The student would answer, somewhat bemused, "They are green, Professor." To which he would say, "Oh good, well when they turn a lovely shade of golden brown or orange, that'll be the autumn when you'll be back here sitting your resit." Luckily, I was not invited to look out of the window. So I managed to pass finals, even managing somehow, to this day I don't know how, to secure a merit viva for surgery, which I hasten to add I didn't get, but I was pleased enough with just a pass. I returned to Mansfield to complete my house jobs, and then went on to complete the GP vocational training scheme. I very briefly toyed with the idea of changing to paediatrics when I had the fortune of working with Roy Harris at Kingsmill Hospital, but the thought of yet more exams just filled me with dread, as in those days there was no requirement to pass FRCGP to pursue a career in general practice. You just had to stay the course of the vocational training scheme for 3 years and come out the other end as a GP. So, having completed vocational training, a far cry from today's situation, there were very few jobs in general practice, and I spent a further 18 months as an F2 in healthcare of the elderly and A&E. And I've never really looked back since. So where is my current practice. I've been in my current practice in Mansfield, of which I'm the executive managing partner since 1996, and we've grown from 8,400 patients and 3 partners to our present 11 partners, 2 registrars, a salaried GP, and almost 20,000 patients. We're delighted that in August last year we received a CQC rating of outstanding. In addition to that, I've held various positions with PCTs, and currently I'm an assistant medical director with NHS England, North Midlands. I'm a GP appraiser and a fee-paid member of the Tribunals Service. So before we move on to my second journey, I'd just like to say a few thank yous, really. I'm proud of my determination and resilience, which I demonstrated in my early, I think it's needless to say, faltering career. And I've thoroughly enjoyed my medical career to date, which I hope will go on just a little bit longer yet. Hopefully you can appreciate just why much being here invited to be your president for 2017 is for me an honour and a privilege given the battle I had to get into medicine. There are many individuals who have contributed to this journey, and I'd like to take this opportunity of thanking each and every one of them, although to do so by name is clearly impossible. In 2007, I achieved membership of the Royal College by the IMAP route, and I'm eternally grateful to our friend and colleague Dr. Naidu for his stewardship and encouragement during that time. I'm sure that gaining this qualification was pivotal to my success in my latter career. The highlight of my career to date, however, has to be my election to fellowship of the college at a ceremony in London in November 2013, which was presided over by Professor Mike Pringle. Before I move on to the second journey in this evening's talk, there are just a few special people I must mention. So a big thank you to my mum and dad, who unfortunately can't be here tonight, for all their support during my studies and early years. The final and most special thank you has to go to my wife Jane and daughters Rebecca and Katie for their understanding when I'm late home yet again, or unable to attend some family event or other, and for their unstinting support in all that I do. So why the second of my journeys? Looking around the Medico room at Nottingham City Hospital, Postgraduate Medical Education Centre, and looking at the photographs of the distinguished past presidents, I thought these individuals are a difficult act to follow. I'm not an academic, I have no published research, and I'm not a professor. Although that would be quite nice if somebody could make me an associate professor just before I retire in 5 years' time, even if it's just for a short-term contract. But being a local lad, I know a fair bit about Nottingham. So here we go on journey number 2, some of the sights, people and events which make Nottinghamshire the great county that it is, in which we live and work. So let's start with something topical. I don't know who had the chance to go to Goose Fair last week. Since my early childhood, I can recall missing only a couple of years, one being last week when, unfortunately, I was rotated to do our extended hours in the surgery. And the only other time I can remember is when Jane and I were on honeymoon in Cyprus, and hopefully that was a valid excuse. So most historians agree that the fair probably started just after 1284, the Charter of King Edward I making reference to this great fair in Nottingham. It's likely that the name is derived from the fact that hundreds of geese were driven from Lincolnshire to be sold in Nottingham. Originally held in September, it moved to its present date, which is the first week in October, in 1752, and has run almost continuously for an amazing 700 plus years, except during the Great Plague of 1646 and both World Wars. Now known for its rides and games, the fair was originally a trade fair, enjoying a particular reputation for high-quality cheese. It relocated from the Market Square to its current site on the Forest Recreation Ground in the early 1920s. It's still reputed to be the largest travelling fair in Europe. Last week I was reminiscing with my family about the fair when I was a child. My mum and dad usually took myself and brothers down to the forest on each of the 3 nights because the fair was then traditionally held on Thursday, Friday and Saturday, the first Friday, Saturday and Thursday in October. It's hard, I know, to believe, but in those days, and we're only talking probably 45 years ago, it was still deemed perfectly acceptable to pay a shilling to see Tiny Tim, a poor man who, with the benefit of hindsight, was afflicted by some form of dwarfism. Luckily, times have changed, and fair has moved on, although remains traditional in some of its ideology and what it achieves for the people of Nottinghamshire. So journeying on, I guess you'll all recognise this tree and the hero associated with it. The major oak, according to folklore, is Robin Hood's shelter, which he shared with his merry men. It weighs an estimated 23 tons, has a girth of 33 feet and a canopy of 92 feet, and it's estimated to be somewhere in the region of 1,000 years old. Now secured by ropes and scaffolding, when I was a child you could actually go inside the tree and play hide and seek. Robin Hood was an heroic outlaw, often depicted as a highly skilled archer and swordsman, famous for robbing from the rich to give to the poor. Some would say a bit like today's Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs. And the character was immortalised in the 1991 film Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, starring Kevin Costner. So as we journey south, Woollerton Hall. Built between 1580 and 1588, and originally owned by the Willoughby family, who made their wealth from one of the main industries of the time, coal mining. It's designed by the architect Robert Smithson and is reputed to be unusual in that it has 365 windows and 52 doors. Despite numerous school trips to the hall in my primary school days, I cannot, however, recall having encountered them all myself. The hall was purchased by Nottingham City Council in 1924 and since then has become synonymous with housing the Natural History Museum for the city and county. For many years, the police horse of Nottinghamshire were housed in stables at Woollerton Hall in the park grounds before being relocated to the police headquarters at Burnstone Park, and subsequently this mounted section was disbanded. But as a child, it used to be the highlight of a Sunday afternoon to go to Woollerton Hall and feed the police horses with sugar lumps. Another famous landmark is Nottingham Castle, or not, as the case may be. Originally a medieval castle stood on the site, and the castle is said to be the starting point for the English Civil War. Totally destroyed after the Civil War, it was replaced by the magnificent ducal mansion, which stands there to this day, in 1674, and in 1875 it was converted to be the first municipal museum outside of London. Nottingham's always been ahead of the game. Famous for its network of tunnels carved into the sandstone on which the castle stands, and Mortimer's Hole, a man-made cave which was probably constructed to allow the garrison station there at the time easy access to the nearby River Leen. Trent Bridge. Originally built in 924 and until the mid-18th century, it's hard to believe, but the next nearest bridge upstream was at Swarkston in Derbyshire. Can you just imagine the traffic congestion if that was still the case today? The current bridge was built in 1871 and it carries the royal coat of arms as the previous bridge was crossed by Queen Victoria in 1840. So I'm sorry, but there are no prizes for anybody who can name this building. Hopefully everybody will recognise it. This is, of course, Nottingham Council House and was designed by Thomas Cecil Howard, built between 1927 and 1929 in the neo-Baroque style. The iconic 200 feet high dome houses the hour bell, affectionately named Little John, which can, depending on weather conditions, so probably not tonight, be heard at over a distance of 7 miles. I was today at the Magistrates' Court and it struck me that even all those years later, the dome of the Council House is still a dominant landmark across the city. The building was constructed from Portland stone quarried from the Isle of Purbeck in Dorset, and the quarry was first opened to provide stone for the construction of St Paul's Cathedral. So we've almost got a bit of St Paul's in the middle of Nottingham. The total cost of the building was £502,000, or in today's money, or rather 2015 when the figure was from, 27,570,000. Since 2011 it served as the city's registry office, and for those unfortunate enough to have been called to attend an inquest, is also the house of the Coroner's Court for Nottingham and Nottinghamshire. I'm sure everybody will know the 2 lions that stand in front of the Council House, which for many years have been a famous meeting point for people. They were created by Joseph Else and named Menelaus and Armageddon, or more popularly known as Leo and Oscar. The old trip to Jerusalem, one of several public houses, unfortunately. in England, which claim to be the oldest, though I'm sure we can prove that this is the oldest. Established in 1189 AD, although there's no documentation to verify this, and the earliest parts of the current structure date from around 1650. The first records of the building being used for the purpose of a public house date from 1751, when it then traded as the Pilgrim. And just a few other sites of interest. Kingsmill Hospital, founded in 1942, was the first US Army hospital in England. And when I started working there as a house officer in 1987, looked very much like the picture there in black and white. I can distinctly recall it still had the old Nightingale-style wards, with patients moving further down the ward away from the nurses' station as their condition improved and they approached the date of discharge. The site now looks very different, and a state-of-the-art District General Hospital stands on the site. So I just thought I'd probably talk a little bit about Nottingham's industrial heritage and where the city founded its wealth. Hosiery. The city was once famous for its lace trade and subsequently developed a large hosiery trade, the vast majority of which has since disappeared due to changing fashions and competition from cheaper overseas production. A gentleman called John Levers invented the machine capable of incorporating intricate patterns of lace, and it's thought that this is where the Nottingham's association with being the lace capital of the world started. We do luckily still contain some of our hosiery heritage, and Speedo swimwear is still developed and manufactured locally and has seen some great success in recent Olympic Games. Coal mining. The closure of Thoresby Colliery in July 2015 brought to an end a 750-year history of coal mining in the county, an industry which generated much of the county's wealth at one time. In the industry's heyday, there were 42 collieries and more than 40,000 miners employed in the county of Nottinghamshire. Indeed, when I worked in Mansfield in my early career, it was the norm for male patients of working age to be engaged in the mining industry in some form or other. The fight goes on to preserve some of this heritage for future generations, the headstocks at the former Clipston Colliery being one example. Tobacco was another mainstay industry of the county. John Player brought cigarette production to Nottingham from West Lothian in Scotland in 1877, establishing the Castle Tobacco Factory in Radford in Nottingham. It was his innovation to manufacture pre-packaged cigarettes, as until then tobacco was only available loose and smokers had to roll their own, that made production possible. Production moved to the New Horizon factory in the early 1970s, which is pictured here, and cigarette production in Nottingham ceased in 2016 when the Horizon factory closed and subsequently has been demolished. So, rally cycles started in 1886 by Richard Morris Woodhead from Sherwood Forest, and a chap called Paul Eugene Louis Onguet, a Frenchman, set up a small cycle workshop in Raleigh Street in Nottingham. Initially, they produced the vast number of 3 cycles per week. In 1887, a local lawyer called Sir Frank Bowden was advised by his doctor that he only had a few months to live and should take up cycling to get better. He went to Raleigh Street, where he found 12 men making cycles and bought one, later buying the entire company. And hence the Raleigh Cycle Company was founded in December 1888. In 1951, the company at its heyday produced an amazing 1 million cycles. So the images here show us Crown Island, or as many locals call it, the Raleigh Island, in the heyday of rally production, and as it is now, home of the Jubilee campus of Nottingham University. So I think the island just depicts the changing landscape of employment opportunities and education in our fair city and county. So in its halcyon day, the company employed 10,000 people and made 2 million cycles per year. Sadly, cycle production gradually fell as people turned more and more to the motor car as their preferred means of transport, and on a night like tonight you can see why. Cycle manufacture in Nottingham ceased in 2003 when production switched to the Far East. Boots. Jesse Boot acquired his first chemist shop in Goosegate in Nottingham in 1877 and set about undercutting the other chemists and doctors who hitherto had practiced a monopoly or near monopoly on prescriptions. He engaged the services of E.S. Waring, a young qualified chemist, and the company began to dispense prescriptions. By 1896, Boots had 60 shops spread over 28 towns and cities, and in 1933, Jesse Boots' widow opened the company's 1,000th store, which incidentally was in Galashiels. The Boots factory and headquarters site at Beeston was developed during the early 1930s, and a number of these buildings remain listed to this day, and they are uniquely referred to on the site by codes such as Building D4 and Building D11. In July 2006, struggling with competition from the large supermarkets, the company merged with Alliance Unichem to form Alliance Boots, which was sold to Walgreens, the United States drugstore master, in 2012. And to conclude my second journey, a few of the inventions for which Nottingham is famous. I didn't realise until I did some research for my talk that Brufen was discovered in the city between 1953 and 1960, and by 1983 had become the fourth most popular prescription drug in the United States of America. HP Sauce, I'm not a fan myself, but I know a lot of people are, was invented by a grocer called Frederick Garton of Basford and was originally made in Sandon Street, New Basford. The Telecan, a forerunner of the video recorder, was invented in the early 1960s by Norman Rutherford, who was an electrical engineer who ran a small TV repair business not a stone's throw from here in Carlton. As we know, the MRI scanner, which has revolutionised investigation of many, many medical problems, was invented by Sir Peter Mansfield at the Nottingham University in the early 1970s. And there were far too many more famous, very famous inventions and findings and research, too numerous to mention this evening. And so to conclude my three journeys, we move on to my third journey, an introduction to my charity for the year, the Links and Knots Air Ambulance, and the vital life-saving journeys which it undertakes. And interestingly, I didn't realise until this evening, but going back in the annals of history of Medci, the air ambulance was also the presidential charity in 2001. So I'm just going to swap the microphone over, and we're lucky enough to have representatives of the Links and Knots Air Ambulance to do a short presentation this evening.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for allowing me to present to you this evening. My name is Matt Woods. I am a critical care consultant working on the Links and Knots Air Ambulance. I too work at Leicester, where I think Dean had his sort of formative medical years by the sounds of it. I have, to carry on the theme of journeys, I have two journeys for you. One, which is the journey of the Links and Knots Air Ambulance. I want to give you a little bit of the background history, tell you where we are now, and tell you sort of roughly where we feel we will be going in the future, certainly with our sort of medical interventions. And I have a patient journey as well, just to illustrate some of the work that we do. Hopefully you'll find that interesting. It all started in the early 1990s, where a group of consultants over in the Boston area and Eastern District really felt that they wanted to improve patient care by providing emergent and urgent transfer services to facilitate movement of critically ill and injured individuals, either from a primary site, i.e. the site of an accident, or from a secondary site, such as a hospital, to the centralised specialist services that were located in Nottingham, say for instance with your good selves in the city, or indeed places like Leicester. So we're talking about vascular services, renal services, dialysis, complex orthopaedics, upper GI, and neurosurgery, to name just a few. And they came up with this sort of aeromedical evacuation concept, which was sort of being bounded around much of the rest of the country at the time. Links and Knots Air Ambulance was actually formed in 1993, but actually had to raise enough revenue to buy or rent a helicopter from Medical Aviation Services, who we're still partnered with now, and actually didn't start operations until April of 1994. Now, the 13th of May 1994 was the day that the first patient was lifted from a Lincolnshire site to a central hospital. So that was our first journey, if you like. However, we all know that the air ambulances are funded by charitable donations. It was no different back in the early 1990s. And the revenue slowly dried up. And the Links and Knots Air Ambulance ceased to function a number of months afterwards. It had been a regular site across the Lincolnshire and Nottinghamshire skies at that point. There was a bit of a public outcry. There was an increase in funding, and fortunately came back into operation and hasn't ceased to function since. What I've got there is a picture of our first aircraft. This is the Messerschmitt Bolko, relatively small aircraft, about 150 miles an hour, with a limited payload capability. It was very cramped at the time, and 2 paramedics would typically operate within the aircraft. So paramedics with the same skill sets of paramedics that would attend you via road. Unfortunately, due to the tail rotor configuration, hot loading, i.e. putting a critically ill patient into the aircraft through the back doors at that time, was unsafe. And so rotors had to be stopped, the engines had to be off, the patient would be loaded, and then you'd take off. But that did take some time. Now, loaded up with a pilot, 2 paramedics and a patient, the endurance of the aircraft was limited, and the top speed was also reduced quite markedly. But Dean talked about Nottingham and the surrounding areas being sort of fairly forward-thinking, and indeed Links and Knots Air Ambulance is no different. And so we've been trailblazers in our aircraft configuration. In 2000, we were one of the first in the country to adopt what is now the standard for air ambulances, the McDonnell Douglas 900. This is a twin-engine aircraft with an endurance of about 3 hours, with a significantly increased payload and a speed of around 160 miles an hour. And what makes it unique is the no tail rotor configuration. You know, typically on an aircraft, on a helicopter, you'd have a rear propeller that would actually counteract the torsional forces, the torque forces that would otherwise spin the aircraft around. And so you see what is essentially a dirty, great big fan on the back to push the air in the opposite direction to prevent the aircraft from spinning when it's taking off. And that, of course, makes it a lot safer to operate for HEMS or helicopter operations. With the 900 series, we adopted a side-loading configuration whereby we opened a door, we'd actually pull out the stretcher and tilt it downwards, and that was a lot safer for our paramedics to operate in. I actually started working with the air ambulance in Links and Knots in about 1998, and so I've been affiliated quite proudly with them since, and I was there at the adoption of this particular aircraft. But by 2010, she was getting a little bit tired, and so we went on to the enhanced McDonnell Douglas Explorer, affectionately known as the 902. This allowed us to have greater lift, higher endurance, and indeed a little bit of extra speed as well, so that we could get around to primary sites and deliver patients quickly to hospital. And under the influence, under the careful guidance of Captain Paul Smith, who's our current chief pilot, we started to undertake nighttime operations, extending the hours that we were able to provide critical care services to the people of Lincolnshire and Nottinghamshire. And it was within this time frame here, 2010 to 2017, that we started to regularly take critical care doctors, such as myself, on the aircraft as well, to start to deliver specialist skills to sites, such as, for instance, pre-hospital anaesthesia, on-site surgery, including, and notwithstanding, amputation, thoracostomies, chest drain insertion, formal thoracotomy and internal cardiac massage, and indeed perimortem caesarean section as well. And all of these have been applied in the past. Thinking where we're going on our journey, we took delivery this year of what is the next generation air ambulance aircraft, and you'll see a lot of these start to filter through air ambulance services here in the UK, the Augusta Westland 169. Weighing just under 5 tons, it's an absolute beast of an aircraft with a speed of around 180 mile an hour, an increased payload allowing for 5 personnel plus a patient, and it has a side loading configuration as well. Its endurance means that it can fly for over 4 hours and 20 minutes without stopping, and that is a significant increase on our previous aircraft. It really is the next generation. We are the only night vision, night flight capable aircraft in the Midlands district, and quite proudly so. We fly with night vision goggles, and our pilots, co-pilots and paramedics are all trained in the use of night vision goggles as well, so we can support other counties out of hours. That's part of the journey for Links and Knots, and that's pretty much to roughly where we are now, but I wanted to illustrate to you what our capabilities are with a case study of an unfortunate young lady in Lincolnshire who I attended in March 2016. And here you have a map of sort of part of Nottinghamshire and Lincolnshire, of course. And what I've done is I've highlighted with the red blob here the location of the incident. This young lady had finished her work, she was getting in her car, she was on a routine journey home when she came into contact with another vehicle in a head-on collision and was critically unwell. If you know the roads around Lincolnshire, you'll understand that the majority are small, single-lane roads, some of them in various states of repair. And the ambulance service itself is very stretched in these areas, and it's very difficult to get anyone with any enhanced capability out, and this is where the air ambulance really comes into its own. We're located roughly here, just off the A15 at RAF Waddington, just south of Lincoln, and we can pretty much get to any area, including Nottingham itself, between 15 and 20 minutes, and that's from takeoff, including pre-takeoff checks as well. So going through to this, call origination to the ambulance service was at 16:41 hours. A fast response paramedic attended the scene where they found a lady in her mid-20s trapped in a car with life-threatening injuries. At 1700 hours, after the ambulance service was alerted to the clinical condition of the patient on scene, we were dispatched to assist on request from the paramedics. We were there in 10 minutes, which included circumventing some pretty aggressive weather by our pilots, which otherwise hampered our on-scene time and would have been there slightly quicker. This is the car that the lady was trapped in. She was trapped for some time via her lower limbs, which were extensively damaged, and her clinical condition was such that she was barely conscious, requiring manual maneuvers to maintain her airway with agonal respiration, very much peri-arrest, requiring some bag valve mask ventilation in the vehicle to maintain saturations anywhere near acceptable. Her pulse was such that she was tachycardic. There was no blood pressure to be attained whatsoever, and we knew that she was in extremis because there was only a central pulse that was palpable. In terms of her Glasgow coma score, her conscious level, it was 9, and such that she was in dire straits. The lower limbs were crushed. There was an open right femoral fracture, and I picked up parts of her humerus off of the floor and popped it into a bag to take to the hospital prior to us leaving the scene. She had to have a rapid extrication from the vehicle, and at 17:33 I applied a pre-hospital anaesthetic to take over her breathing, again to protect her brain and her vital organs. We left the scene at 17:47 and we were at the hospital at 18:10, and that just shows you how quick we can get a severely injured casualty from deepest, darkest countryside like Lincolnshire to our major trauma centre here at Queen's. What were the interventions that we applied that made any difference to her? Well, firstly, we used intraosseous devices because intravenous access was tenuous, so we used a bone gun, essentially, to give her fluid, bolster her blood pressure, and then apply the anaesthetic medications. We used a pelvic binder to close the pelvic fracture to reduce the bleeding and to hold the pelvis in position. We used a Kendrick traction device, pictured here, a long leg splint similar to the Thomas splint of old, if you like, but lightweight, portable, and designed to ensure that there was no vascular compromise. And finally, of course, the intervention of pre-hospital anaesthesia, which I'm sure you will recognise is not without significant risk. But nevertheless, we are able to sedate, intubate, ventilate, and get her to hospital safely. Packaging was important, and she received bilateral finger thoracostomy, so surgery on site to release 2 pneumothoraces, and that improved ventilation markedly. And we were able to radio ahead to speak to Queen's Medical Centre to ensure that blood was available. Links and knots played only a very small part in that lady's journey, but the important part that we played was getting her to hospital alive. It was up to QMC then, the major trauma team, the physios, the occupational therapists, to continue her care, and I'm pleased to say that she's made an excellent recovery and is back home with her young family in Lincolnshire, despite what is extensive injuries. Links and Knots has always been innovative, and what is the future for other people is already in practice at Links and Knots. We already undertake lactate measurement, say for instance. We undertake video laryngoscopy or indirect laryngoscopy with our McGrath video laryngoscope. And we employ pre-hospital ultrasound to visualize the heart in subcostal echoes, and also the abdomen to determine if there is any intra-abdominal bleeding. And we are currently training our paramedics to follow us as critical care consultants in applying that autonomously. One of the most recent innovations is blood, and you see Dr. Cook's in here with our blood bag, blood on board, or Bob, I think the guys called it, which I think in Nottinghamshire means something different. But we carry O negative blood for direct use, and we are able to give transfusions on scene. Where are we going from here? Well, our journey will take us into what I believe to be balloon occlusion techniques. I don't think it's so fanciful to think that this is the way that we will go, certainly with our clinical interventions. And we are currently looking at REBOA, which is the balloon occlusion of the aorta. So under ultrasound control in the field for someone who is exsanguinating from a pelvis, or indeed lower limb injuries, we'll be able to apply a small catheter, place that into a femoral artery, retrograde introduction into the aorta, inflate a balloon to prevent any further bleeding from the distal sources. And this is already being applied by London Air Ambulance as well. I think that clotting products, lyophilized, powdered clotting products for reconstitution will be on the horizon soon as well. And fibrinogen concentrate is receiving rave reviews throughout the European pre-hospital systems. And on the far side here, on the right, believe it or not, this is a portable pathology lab. And we'll be able to undertake near-patient testing on scene for things like electrolytes, for blood counts, coagulation, and indeed, even in extreme circumstances, such tests as troponin for heart conditions and beta-HCGs for pregnancy. Just to remind you that we are a charity, and hopefully that little taster, if you like, of the work that we undertake will infuse you to support us. Costs are roughly £2.5 million per annum to run the aircraft, around £2,500 per tasking, and we are tasked between 3 and 4 times a day. And so you can easily see that the cost of such a venture racks up quite significantly. And we are currently looking at roughly £10,000 worth of operations per typical day. I'll be pleased to take any questions that you have.